Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nate Nims from Grace, and on Wednesdays during Lent at Grace, typically we have these soup and sermon gatherings where we invite someone in from the community to teach about whatever we're studying, to give us a little sermon, to tell us about ways that we can get involved in their work. And this afternoon, originally, we had Lee Rhoda Scott scheduled to come and speak to us. She works at Women at the Well right now. It's the United Methodist congregation that meets at the Mitchellville Women's Facility. Lee, of course, is not with us this morning, and I am. And because it's soup and sermon, I briefly thought about eating soup while speaking to you today, but I know personally how much I hate the sound of food being eaten, especially over something like this, that I decided to hold back. So I hope you have soup. I hope you have something to eat. I hope you're enjoying yourself as best as you can, and I hope you enjoy the time that we have together this afternoon. Just a couple of things that you can do to make sure that you're staying connected with Grace. If you haven't signed up for our emails yet, you can do that on Facebook. There's a little link on the page that says sign up for emails. We send out an email at least once a week, if not more during these days, and you can stay connected with us that way. If any of these are ever helpful, feel free to like and share and recommend them to folks. And if people that you know would like to watch these but don't have Facebook, on our website, gracedesmoines.org, Ben Campney is doing an awesome job updating that and posting all the videos there so anyone can watch them. And then for your continued support of our church, your prayers, your support, it means everything right now. So thank you for what you're doing to support us and support our church. Now, we have been studying the Sermon on the Mount at Grace. That has been our focus throughout the season of Lent. And in these 40 days, we give things up. And this year, we are truly giving things up. But we give things up so that we can prepare ourselves for Easter, for this hope of resurrection and renewal. And that renewal and that resurrection, that new being, that transformed life is really represented in the Sermon on the Mount. It's Jesus's most succinct teaching. But in the Gospel of Matthew, while there's the Sermon on the Mount, in the Gospel of Luke, there's the Sermon on the Plain. And there are a number of subtle and yet otherwise large differences between the two of them. So I thought we could have just a little bit of a Bible study this morning, going through those details, because when I was a college student, one of the reasons why I got interested in religious studies was looking at things like this, realizing that there was always more to learn and discover, and I could take in more and more, and I just got fascinated by this stuff. So, hi Elaine, good to see you. Thanks everybody for joining us. So let's look at some differences between the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew and the Sermon on the Plain in Luke. Now, these differences exist because the Gospels were written over a long period of years. Now, in the Gospels that we have it now, in this New Testament as we have it now, it opens with the Gospel of Matthew. But Matthew likely was not the first book of the New Testament written. Most scholars agree that Paul and his letters were the earliest Christian pieces of communication. That was how word in the early church began to spread. Paul's first letters were probably 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, and 1 Corinthians. Those were likely the first communications within Christendom. Now, around the year 70 or so, that's when we think the Gospel of Mark was written. Now, we don't have the document that they think Mark used. We've never found any traces of it, but theorists and biblical scholars are fairly confident that there was a source called Q that was a collection of the sayings of Jesus, that it wouldn't have been any of the narrative, it wouldn't have been the details of where Jesus was walking or where they were traveling, but the sayings of Jesus would have been collected in this document that we now call Q, and even though it's never been found, you can buy it in a store. So whether or not Q existed, it exists now. So scholars believe that Mark took that source, those sayings of Jesus from Q that would have been written down, as well as the oral tradition that people had. And that's how the Gospel of Mark was written. A few years later, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospels of Luke were written as well. And I think about Matthew and Luke like I would think about an English teacher grading some papers, because they're very similar. Now, there are some differences, but they're very similar. Enough similarities that if I was an English teacher, I would ask Matthew and Luke to come to school and explain why they had so much in common, right? It seems like there's not plagiarism, but they worked with one another. They enforced each other's stories in different ways. The differences between Matthew and Luke, like the differences between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, can be explained in thinking of the different ways that the communities would have come together and told and understood these stories. Think of the different audiences that they would have written to. Because odds are, there's a story that you tell in your family one way, and that same story that you tell to your friends is probably a little different. And if you were having coffee at work, how you told that story would be a little different still. There are details and nuances and different aspects of the text that make sense to one group, but not to another. That's where a lot of the differences in these Gospels come from. They were writing to different audiences. They were writing to different communities that had different concerns and questions and different ideas about what everything meant. The Gospels, as they write the story of Jesus as well, a professor of mine liked to say, no one followed Jesus around with a red pen. It wasn't as if there was a scribe following around, transcribing everything that Jesus wrote. So the Gospels, while we read them literately and not literally. And here's what I mean by that. Literally means we look at the whole scope of what it's saying, and we look at the aspects, and we can understand what this means theologically. What is the message that they're trying to get across? What is the point that they want to make about humanity or God or the sake of our lives together? They're telling a story in a certain way to make a theological point. They're not necessarily making a historical fact claim that this event happened, and then that event happened, and then that event happened. Right? Like if you wanted to play back this video, you could find the exact moment when my cat Selena stopped napping behind me and then decided to come around and sit on my lap. We know that order of events because we can play it back on camera. But in a time and in a place where they didn't have those cameras, where they didn't have those resources, they had the stories, they knew the details, they knew the sayings, but the narrative would sometimes shift, not because they were trying to be dishonest, not because they were trying to be misleading. They were just making a point. They were speaking theologically about what was going on and what this means and why that matters. It's to be read literally, to be understood within this genre of writing, to be seen as part of this whole that represents this story of God and what God is up to in the world. So in Matthew, there's the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew writes very clearly at the start of this sermon that Jesus is with a large crowd, and so he goes up onto a mountain and sits there and begins to teach. Now, there's a couple details that we know because of the wording that Matthew uses. Matthew writes that Jesus sits down because rabbis, like Jesus was in the first century, sat when they taught. Teachers were given that place of comfort due to their privilege and prestige. A good rabbi would sit while they taught because they would probably be teaching for quite some time, so they would sit as their pupils listened to them teach. Matthew also writes that Jesus was giving these from the mountain because Matthew is comparing Jesus to Moses. So Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and brings down the Ten Commandments, right? Moses comes down with these tablets and these teachings from God about how we should live our lives together. And what does Jesus do in the Sermon on the Mount? After the Beatitudes, after telling us that we are salt and light, Jesus goes on to say, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Jesus is teaching about the law and the prophets, about these 10 commandments, this way that we orient our lives with one another, and Jesus is expanding on it. Jesus is saying it's one thing not to hate someone, it's another to murder them, right? Jesus is saying, you've heard this, don't kill, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus is expanding on the Sermon on the Mount. And because Matthew was most likely written before Luke, that's an important little detail, because as the Christian movement expanded and grew, it started with just the Jewish followers of Jesus, but eventually Gentiles, non-Jewish folks, started coming into this Jewish movement. And those non-Jewish folks are more represented in how Luke tells the story. Matthew highlights a lot of the Jewishness of Jesus, and Luke doesn't ignore it, but Luke doesn't explain it either. Luke just sort of has a more accessible story to folks that wouldn't have known the background or the history or those aspects of the nuance. So in Matthew, Jesus is there as this new Moses, this lawgiver that comes to give this sermon and tell us what God wants in our lives and how we're supposed to treat one another. In Luke, in chapter 6, that's where the Sermon on the Plain is. And Luke writes that Jesus found a level place and began teaching from there. Luke goes out of their way to say, one Sabbath, I just lost my place, I am sorry, that Jesus finds this level place and begins teaching. He stood in a large area on level ground. Luke wants us to know that Jesus is one of us. This is a way of Luke saying Jesus was fully human. Like, Luke wants you to know that God is with you. God is in this moment on our level. Jesus is not some teacher from on high scolding us. Not that I see Jesus doing that in the Sermon on the Mount, but Luke wants us to make sure that we know Jesus is on our same level, that we are all on this same level together. That's why when some people talk about the kingdom of God, that phrase Jesus uses a lot throughout the Gospels, every now and then you'll hear people say kingdom of God, because we're all kin, we're all family, we're all in this together, we're all on the same level. Moments like this make that really clear, right? No matter what your status, no matter what your ability, no matter what your skill, we are all in this together. We are all social distancing. We are all wrestling with the same questions. We're all on the same level. And in Luke wants to make that very clear. Jesus is at this level with us. Jesus is teaching from this level plane, coming to us as one of us to tell us something about who God is and what God is like and what that means for how we treat one another. Now, the Sermon on the Mount is longer in Matthew than the Sermon on the Plain is in Luke. In Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount is chapters 5, 6, and 7. In Luke, it is only part of chapter 6. Now, the rest of the teachings that are in Matthew, they show up in Luke, but just in different places and in different orders. And one thing scholars believe is that this means the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, these teachings of Jesus would have been his most consistent message, because these teachings, these sayings, they show up in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're just organized in different ways because they're making different theological claims. So they're all there, but just in a different order, just in a different arrangement. Now, if you were with us 3 weeks ago now at Grace, we started this Sermon on the Mount series, and we spent one Sunday with the Beatitudes in Matthew. If you missed that Sunday and want, you can look it up and watch the service on Facebook if you're interested. But we spent a lot of that Sunday on the first Beatitude, on the first blessing that Jesus says. And that first Beatitude, that first blessing in Matthew is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Luke changes that wording just a little bit. Luke takes a couple words out. Luke says, "Blessed are the poor." Luke writes a gospel of social holiness, while Matthew writes more of a gospel of personal piety. In the United Methodist Church, our tradition is about holding those two things together. We have our personal faith. We have the prayers and the rituals and the routines, the spirituality that grounds us and connects us with God. And you see a lot of that in Matthew, this spirituality, this hope, this prayer that keeps us connected with God. But in Luke, you see much more of this social holiness because you are grounded in God, because you trust that God is with the least of these. We just say boldly and completely, blessed are the poor. Luke is making a very clear theological point that God is on the side of those that are left behind, overlooked, lost, and put down. Luke goes on to write that blessed are the poor because the kingdom is yours. Blessed are you who hunger now because you will be satisfied. Blessed are you who weep now because you will laugh. Luke makes clear that these moments in our lives, while they come and while they go, God is with us in every one of them. And God starts. God is primarily positioned with the poor, with the mourning, with the confused, with the lost, with the overlooked. Luke wants us to know that the people that are on the margins are the people that are on God's heart. It's a very clear statement that yes, God cares about the poor in spirit. You can see that in how Luke does the Beatitudes. But Luke also goes out of their way to clearly say God cares about our economics. God cares about the people that are poor. God cares about the people that are overlooked. Those are the folks that are on God's heart. Now in Matthew, after the Beatitudes, Jesus goes on to say, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Luke does not do that, though. Luke mirrors the Beatitudes with some woes, with saying, how terrible. Luke says, how terrible for you who have plenty now, because you will be hungry. How terrible for you who laugh now, because you will mourn. How terrible for you when all speak well of you, because their ancestors did the same thing to false prophets. You see how Luke mirrors things, right? Like Luke goes out of their way to start by saying, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who grieve. And then Luke says, woe to you, how terrible things for you will be. Luke reminds us of this flow of our lives, that we are up one moment and down another. And it's something that this moment in our lives is teaching us as well, because 2 weeks ago, 2 months ago, did we imagine we would be in a moment such as this? Luke, by saying, blessed are the poor, and then saying, how terrible for you who are rich, reminds us that we have to be prepared for these reversals, that we have to orient our hearts and our lives and communities in certain ways, that we take care of one another, that we look after one another just as God looks after and cares for us. It's very interesting that Luke does that, this holding together of our hearts and our communities. Then, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus goes into, you have heard it said, but I say to you, right? There's this long series of text where Jesus explains something that the law and the prophets had said, some tradition, some ritual, some law, some ethic or moral. But then Jesus modifies it or expands it and says, this is what our goal is, right? Be perfect as your heavenly God is perfect. Love one another completely. While Matthew goes into this back and forth on you have heard it said, but I say to you, Luke skips all that. And it's not that Luke skips it because they think it's not important. Luke bypasses all that because they're not writing to a primarily Jewish audience. Remember, Luke is writing after Matthew. Matthew's audience was mostly Jewish, mostly folks that would have known the law and the prophets. They would have had those connections. They would have had that base in their theological background. But Luke is writing to people that are new to Christianity, that didn't start with that Jewish faith and aren't moving forward from that background. So Luke doesn't need to bring that up because Luke thinks this will probably just confuse them, so let's get straight to the point. After the Beatitudes in Luke, they go straight into the main point of what we talked about this last Sunday. Luke writes that Jesus says, but I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners expect to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting as children of the Most High, for God is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be compassionate, just as your Creator is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Right? Luke, they just go straight to the point. This is what God wants you to be like. You need to have an ethic. You need to have a moral system. You need to have a background that is held together with this faith in God. But then Luke just goes straight to it and says, love one another. Don't just love your neighbors. Pray for those that annoy you. Don't just love your family. Reach out beyond those bonds to this whole wider world, giving without expecting anything in return, because God gives and gives and gives and gives. Luke gives us this picture of God that says we are blessed and we are beloved, and if God cares for everyone, we should be people that care for everyone as well. Luke gets straight to the point. In thinking of this time in our lives, maybe it's really important for us to get straight to the point as well. There are a lot of things that are being exposed with everything. There are a lot of things that are wrong that we definitely need to make right. And now we have an opportunity to do that, to be clear about what it means to love one another, to be good to one another. Luke wants us to do that explicitly. That's what fascinates me about the Sermon on the Plain compared to the Sermon on the Mount. And this was just a little introduction to biblical theory. There are all sorts of other nuances that you can look at throughout the Gospels that show us these little differences, that highlight the communities and the circumstances and the ways that the Gospels were understood when they were first written to the different communities and the different peoples that would have heard them. This teaching of Jesus, though, this Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain, it continues to show us in either gospel how we treat one another must first be grounded in love. And not just a love for ourselves, not just a love for the people that think and act and do things like us, but a love for everyone. A love that reaches out to those on the margins, to the poor in spirit and to the poor. It is clear in both gospels that we have to care for one another because God cares for every one of us. In a moment like this, could that teaching be any more important, any more vital to how we live our lives? Whatever you are having for lunch, whether it's soup or a salad like Ben, I hope you can think about those that might not have something and then find a way to reach out. If you were at the last Soup and Sermon that we had, Sarah from DMARC is there. And DMARC is doing a lot of virtual fundraisers right now, a lot of virtual food drives to make sure they can help folks that are on the margins. Luke says, blessed are the poor. And by how we care for one another, we can prove Luke's blessing to be true. That because those people are on God's heart, they need to be on our hearts. Because those folks are cared for by God, we will care for them too. The Sermon on the Mount again and again tells us we are beloved, we are blessed, and we are empowered so that we can love and bless and empower one another. God has trusted us to this work, so let's prove ourselves to be trustworthy. So I hope this little introduction to the differences between the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plains has been helpful, or at least interesting. These sorts of biblical studies always fascinate me, and if you want to learn more, frankly, I've got some ideas on more videos and things like this to do to stay connected, but if there's anything you want to know or anything you want to ask or things that you'd like to chat about, let me know and we'll do a video on that. We've got plenty of time to get together this way, and we'll find more ways to get together as well. So also, on that same note, a number of folks have started to sign up for our Bridge the Gap groups. Just because we're doing social distancing doesn't mean we can't communicate with one another. So we're going to bridge the gap between us by communicating with one another. A link is on our Facebook feed. It's been sent out in an email. It's going out in a letter as well. So if you want to get connected and haven't yet, I'd encourage you to do so. We're going to hopefully have the first of those groups put together soon, within the next day or two. So we hope you can get involved. And if there's anything that we can do to help, let me know. We've got a growing list of volunteers that want to help make a difference, that want to be the people that know we are blessed and beloved and can make a difference, and God has trusted us to make a difference. So we're going to do that. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out, for your support, for listening to me ramble while I tried to contain my cat, Selena. She's calmed down a little bit compared to the last video that we did, so that's half the fun of this, though, right? Waiting to see her, claw me, which she hasn't done in a while, thankfully. She's calmed down in her old age. But thank you, everybody. I'm enjoying this as much as I can, getting connected with you these ways, and we'll keep doing it in the days and weeks to come. So if there are other ways that you'd like to connect, let me know. Sign up for one of the Bridge groups, and thank you for being the people that God already knows that you are, for the ways that you care for one another and make this love tangible in our world and in our community. So thanks for joining us for this Soup and Sermon. Next week, we will have a special guest, though. So my wife, my spouse, Irene, she is a deaconess in the United Methodist Church, and deaconesses are an order through the United Methodist Women that recognizes laity that do important work in the community. Irene just started working for Iowa Interfaith Power and Light. They are an environmental advocacy group that is doing a lot of important work to get congregations and people of faith connected to environmental policy change and the ways that we can help be a positive force in the world. So next week, Irene will be joining us for this Soup and Sermon. So next Wednesday at 12:10, we will be doing this again, and you'll have a guest speaker too. So I really hope you'll enjoy that. And if you liked this and you think somebody else might like it, feel free to share it with them and pass it on. And then tonight, we will be having a general conference discussion on Facebook at 6 o'clock. As you may have already heard, the general conference is postponed to a date that has yet to be set. So even though it's postponed, we know what we will be talking about and what we will be debating. So we'll be talking about that tonight at 6 p.m. Thank you, everybody. And if you need anything, be in touch.